believe we have our audience. So, and I'm the first presenter. Greetings, everyone. I think perhaps I should just go ahead and welcome everybody. I'm Max Dupuy. I'm with the Regulatory Assistance Project, and I'm the first presenter. I think we lost our host, Jennifer Turner. This is a Wilson Center event, and I will go ahead and get on with the show and make my initial presentation. Well, the theme of the event today is unlocking China's clean energy transition. And I'm going to lead off here. Thanks, first of all, to the Wilson Center and to Jennifer, who I hope will be back with us shortly. I'll say I'm happy to join with my friends Jan and Anders today. I'm going to start off with an introductory overview of China's power sector reform. And I'll give a broad sketch of the issues that we're going to be talking about today, at least the issues relating to power sector reform. And then I believe my colleagues will get into more detail, and we'll have time, I understand from Jennifer, for discussion as well. We're each going to give very broad or very short initial presentations. Now, power sector reform is a fundamental element for China's decarbonization goals. And this is actually a great moment to be having this session, thanks to Jennifer and the Wilson Center, because power sector reform is currently a very hot topic with policymakers and industry stakeholders in China. The current push for power sector reform in China actually started in 2015, and there's been significant progress over the last 6 years with that effort. But in recent months, the discussion about power sector reform in China has ramped up significantly, partly due to the decarbonization pledges that came out last year, and partly due to the more recent power shortages that have been in the news. In fact, just last week, Xi Jinping chaired a top-level meeting of officials that covered related power sector issues. And a statement came out of that meeting, and it included a call for national electricity markets. But I think it's fair to say that the meeting hit on most of the major ingredients of overall power sector reform. So in addition to markets, the meetings called for strengthening the integrated planning of the power system, strengthening of regulation and monitoring, optimization of power resources. And the statement also referred to the market as having a supporting role in the transition to a clean and low carbon energy economy. Now, the challenge, of course, is translating this kind of high-level direction into implementation of the details of planning, markets, regulation, and so on to support clean energy. And this isn't just a problem for China. Every country that wants to decarbonize the power sector is struggling with some version of this same set of detailed problems. Now, in China, as in other countries, a big picture challenge for decarbonization is to build out a new system of clean resources and orchestrate those resources on a minute-by-minute basis. Large-scale wind and solar farms, hydro stations, and energy storage on the bulk grid need to work together seamlessly with customer behavior and customer-side resources, including distributed generation, electric vehicle battery charging, customer-side resources, including and so on and so on. So the US, the European Union, China, and other countries around the world are all looking at some version of this vision. There are many variations on the theme, and there's a lot of debate and discussion about how, say, in 2050, the mix of resources in any particular part of the world is going to look, and how to get it all done at least cost. But the basic vision is similar in China as in the rest of the world, at least the version that's emerging in that broad sense. Now, a key word in this kind of power sector transformation is flexibility. We're going to be using that word a lot today. Increasing the flexibility of the system in order to integrate wind and solar resources on the grid. The basic point is that weather conditions, of course, change minute by minute, hour by hour, season by season, and a power system with high levels of wind and solar energy needs to have a lot of flexibility to keep the system balanced. Now, looking out at the next 10 years or so, a big challenge is really to reform policy and regulation, power sector reform, to get the most out of existing clean energy technology. So in other words, when you look at the challenges the next decade or so, the immediate challenges aren't really about inventing entirely new clean energy technologies. Instead, the challenge is to get the policies, the regulation, the market mechanisms working in a way that optimizes existing technology in a low-cost manner. And in particular, the cost of wind generation and solar generation have really declined dramatically in China and around the world. In many places, it's now cheaper to construct new solar and wind generation capacity than to simply operate existing coal-fired and gas-fired generation plants. This is a really dramatic change. The estimates on the screen are from Bloomberg, NEF. There's some debate about whether we're actually at this point in China yet, where renewables are competitive with coal, but if not now, then likely soon. And I should point out that renewable energy is not the only resource that's falling in price. Battery storage technologies are also coming down in cost. And of course, there continue to be large opportunities to save costs and emissions by investing in energy efficiency. Now, another good piece of news in China is that the curtailment rate for wind and solar has fallen in recent years. And the curtailment rate is a measure of how much wind and solar energy is wasted and not taken into the grid from existing installed capacity. And it's been useful to watch as a kind of very rough barometer of rigidities in the power system that have hampered the growth of renewable energy. But again, the curtailment rate has fallen, and that's good news. And this has happened as China continues to be a world leader in building out large amounts of wind and solar capacity. And some of this improvement in the situation with curtailment reflects genuine improvements in policy, some new market mechanisms and new steps towards the way that the grid is operated on a day-to-day basis. I don't want to paint an entirely rosy picture. Not all the measures taken so far have been ideal, and there are significant remaining rigidities and barriers to flexibility in the power system. And we'll be talking more as we go through our presentations and discussion today about those barriers and rigidities. Really something to emphasize is that China and really the rest of the world are now really still at the foothills of clean energy transformation and decarbonization. China has been a world leader again for over the past decade in installing wind and solar power generation capacity. But from a decarbonization perspective, there's still a lot of investments in renewable energy to come. There are many different scenarios looking out to 2060 or so. This is one of the more dramatic ones from the China Energy Transformation Outlook that just came out recently. But the main point here is that the big challenge is just to make sure that the power system has enough flexibility to absorb all this these variable energy resources to come. And this is where Chinese policymakers have been struggling to some extent. So this brings me to just a few quick themes I'll mention for next steps for power sector reform in China. The first theme is that the large state-owned enterprises that own and operate coal power plants are still at least partly insulated from economic reality. There's been some downward pressure over in recent years on the hours of operations that individual coal plants have, and been pressure on the revenue as a result of overall overcapacity in the system, and also pressure from the new market mechanisms, particularly in Northwest China, where coal generators have suffered substantial financial losses. And in fact, the government agency that oversees state-owned enterprises has been restructuring the ownership of coal generation in the Northwest in reaction to those financial losses. But overall, coal generators are still partly insulated from this economic reality that clean resources are increasingly competitive. And the state-owned enterprises are continuing to build out new coal capacity in the face of what is arguably general overcapacity in the system. So what's needed here is a continued sharpening of the new market mechanisms that will continue ramping up pressure on coal generators and coal generator revenue. I believe Yan will talk about a new policy that came out recently in October that subjects coal generators to new market pressures. Also important will be continued pushes from China's existing administrative procedures that mandate retirement of coal capacity. And a new emerging carbon market can increasingly be a part of this pressure on coal as that carbon market is developed and refined. Another theme for power sector reform is unlocking the value of flexible resources, particularly on the demand side. Again, China's been doing China's been doing a lot, a world leader in deploying electric vehicles and other forms of electrification, including electrification of heating in buildings. But there's still a lot of work to be done in terms of getting flexibility out of electric vehicles and other electrified end uses. In short, potentially EV charging could be directed to times of days when renewable energy is plentiful, but there's a lot to do to make sure that this is part of the solution and not part of the problem. The final theme for power sector reform that I'll mention is regionalization. And this is where the concept of regional or national grids come in, supergrids, if you will. A regional approach to system operations, to markets, and to planning will be important to supporting those higher levels of wind and solar on the grid. And the basic idea here is that wind and solar output can be balanced over larger geographical areas. And provincial level spot markets within provinces are just getting underway in China. A spot market creates a price that fluctuates throughout the day, and these flexible prices can be helpful in sending signals for needed flexibility on the grid. There are some successful international examples of these markets, and of course, the key is getting the details right for China and finding workable models that fit the institutional structure in China. But ideally, these markets are going to operate across provinces, not just within provinces. And there's a lot of policy discussion going on in this front, which we'll get into. Southern Grid is supposed to be an early market, but it's still under development. New investment in transmission have the promise to tie these markets together. Again, the idea of a super grid. But this is another area where technology is there. China's developed ultra-high voltage technology. The key is to clear away barriers between provinces that are in the realm of policy and regulation. Now, this is a good place for me to stop and hand the microphone over to Yan. I'm not sure if Jennifer is back with us.
I am back.
Good.
No, thank you. No, yeah. The second the meeting started, my Mac suddenly stopped functioning. So I'm on my PC right now, but you know, again, in my intro I was saying like, well, today I have a trio of sharp speakers who are going to talk about how China's grappling with the power sector reforms. I could have added, and speakers who will grasp and kind of run the meeting for me as I'm working with my tech problem. So thank you so much, Max. You already figured out, but I mean, I don't know what you said at the beginning, but you are at the Woodrow Wilson Center China Environment Forum meeting today, part of our clean energy transition meetings. I don't need to do the rest of my intro because Max's opening gave you a great baseline of the major challenges of what China's facing in the grid. And now we're going to go diving deeper. Yenqing, who's a lead analyst at Refinitiv, she's got over 15 years of wrestling with issues of power market deregulation, provincial power trading. And she's gonna you guys are going to know about markets at the end of this meeting. You're going to be fluent in supergrid. Speaking of you out in the audience, I've already started getting some questions underneath the streaming screen. There's a widget for you to submit questions live. So when my three fabulous speakers are done, I'm going to start asking your questions. So Yenqing, thanks again for being patient as I disappeared and I'm back. And Yenqing, why don't you take it away?
Thanks, Jennifer. Thanks, Max. Hello, everyone. Yeah, can see my screen, right?
Yes, it's perfect.
Yes. Yeah. So yeah, that's great. Thanks for inviting me to the event, and I'm happy to discuss China power sector reform and specifically power trading. And it was a great introduction by Max on more power market, the role of power market, and actually the really from China's perspective. And I will zoom in to discuss an overview of recent policy and trends. So I'm actually not too far from the Northern Lights. I mean, based in Norway. at Refinitiv, I work with the power and carbon market. So my day job is staring at power prices in Europe and carbon prices. So yes, I mean, from European perspective, in Europe, with so many countries, actually their power system these are cross-country interconnectors. Just see how many from Norway, and I'm now at here. So we're not too far from many hydropower plants as well. So from my work with the European power market, that's really, I learned that while the liberalized power markets really enables the resources, they can be utilized in a much wider area. So you have hydropower and wind in Denmark and UK, the solar power in Germany and Spain, and then a little bit of coal and lots of the nuclear power here, but they are transmitted on an hourly basis. So currently I may be consuming some wind power from Denmark. And thanks to the liberalized market and a economic dispatch, and we'll mention spot market a lot, but spot markets, as Max said, that is really, you have the costs of power generation determining the prices. So that really shows the advantage of what power sector reform or liberalization can help. So from China's perspective, so yeah, I mean, different map, but all in all, an efficient power market and grid can really help renewables deployment in China. Here are excellent data. You can find them in China's National Renewables Monitoring Center. And these are China's wind, the greener wind, and solar installed capacity by province. And as of end of September, you can see that, I mean, in China, there's a vast resources in wind and solar, and they are most located in the West, more in the West. But we all know that in China, where the industrial engine, where contributing most GDP growth is on the East. So they are a bit lack of resources. So really if a better power market design can help to utilize the vast renewable resource in a wider area, it can bring cheaper power. It can also help decarbonization. But the reality is far from perfect. And a lot of us has been heard of their shortages in China in late September, mostly, especially in northern China, where it affected residentials as well. But on 1 or 2 days, when the 3 provinces are having near 10 gigawatt gap in power supply, the grid is still transmitting power to Hebei and Shandong province. But why? Because there's some rigid long-term power contracts. So see, here is really an example. A more efficient power market design can help to increase supply security and utilize resources much better. But of course, it's not an easy way. But this year, in past months, there's a significant milestone. China's power sector reform speeded up this October. And immediate cause is really the power shortages in late September, where it is really a coal shortage plus power shortage and rigid power price structure made the policymaker seize the advantage of more flexible power pricing. But on the other hand, the power sector reform, it is a very long process in the making, where the first round has started in 2002 already. That is when I still living in China. But then really currently we always talk about the new round of power sector reform, or second round of power sector reform, is the one from 2015, where there's this very important document number 9, on further deepening power sector reform. So this is really a guideline which still many of the proposals in this document is still being gradually implemented. And then in this October, on 12th October, the NDRC issued a reform on coal-fired power tariff. And again, as Max said in his intro, on 24th of November, where the Central Commission, well, actually President Xi Jinping notes that China will establish a national, it says, unified electricity market. And we believe this definitely going to bring the power sector reform into more rapid implementation from now on. And again, I need to stress that why there's a huge turnaround 6 years after this document number 9. It's triggered by power shortage, but it is really because China has set a target of peak carbon emissions by 2030 and reach carbon neutral by 2060. So the regulator must be aware of that effective market and price signals. It could facilitate the decarbonization of the energy system. So yes, so that's really the current progress and background and drivers for why the power sector reform has speeded up. And so let's have a closer look of the key highlights of the October reform document. Well, the title of it says 2021 coal-fired tariff reform, and it brings up 4 key points. Just a 2-pager, but it's so significant. But first of all, it really brings more power generation into the market. And here in the market, we mean really it's mid to long-term trading. So here is data from China Electricity Council. They publish monthly China power trading data. Again, mostly mid to long-term, but they're very useful. You can check on their website. The orange bars are China's yearly total power consumption, and the blue one are those transacted mostly in mid to long-term markets, in mid to long-term power contracts, or usually it's direct purchase, etc. But you can see the share is increasing. And so as of October, it's almost 44%, I believe, with more power generation. So all of coal-powered power generation will be into the market, and industrial commercial users are now being quickly brought into mid to long-term power trading. So this year could boost to, I think, around 60% as of next year. So apart from bringing more generation into the mid to long-term trading, a game changer of the October reform is really on this part, the 3.3. That is, all of industrial and commercial users, currently only less than half of them are buying electricity from bilateral transactions. But now all of them, they have to buy from the market or through bilateral negotiations or mid to long-term trading organized by the power exchange, or they can buy from grid companies. So grid companies will be an agent. So this is a game changer, because previously grid company, we think they are more into the transmission and distribution net, but now they become they are operating as agent and selling the electricity as well. And again, what is really game changing in the 12th October reform is that established an idea now that power price is established by market. It can both rise or decrease. It is not set as this fixed catalog. It cannot be regulated anymore. It is not only the October power sector reform document is important. There are many other policies that has been announced throughout the year. And why? Because after China has announced 2060 carbon neutral pledge in the power system, there was a new concept called new power system with renewables as the mainstay. So a lot of policies on how to ramp up renewables development and how to facilitate renewables integration, and that has been brought forward. I just put out a few important ones. And the first one is, again, even before we have the coal-fired tariff reform, there's already a policy called to gradually implement time of use electricity price. So to have more tiered power pricing, even for residential and industrial users. And there's, we all know it's peak, off-peak, or peak valley. And there's also a new concept called critical peak. Basically, it's where a few hours where the load or the consumption are the highest, could be 7, 8 in the morning, or 9, 5, 6 in the afternoon in the rush hour, where power price was exceptionally higher. So many provinces start to implement this as well. So basically, what does it mean? To change consumers' behavior through the prices. It's to wash your clothes in the evening or charge your EVs in the night, not in the rush hour, etc. And another important official document was released last week. It is the cross-provincial spot trading rules. This was based on existing rules from 2017, which governs the surplus renewable spot trading cross provinces. But the new rules are much more enhanced because it covers not only the long distance ultra high voltage lines, but it also allows spot trading in provinces in the same regional grid. An example was brought was Chongqing and Sichuan, so that they can also buy electricity from each other through the rules specified here. And also the new rules applies to all type of generation. So it can be coal, can be nuclear, so not only renewables. And there are two very huge policy documents I'm very much looking forward to as well. I think they are forthcoming. For one is the draft national spot power trading rules, which is in internal consultation around, and it really looks a bit like what European market and what we have been doing in the US as well, regional markets, but it has very details on transactions, etc., on market participants. So yeah, really looking forward to when this will be finally published, but I think it may take a few months as well. But I think this one, again, at the 24th November meeting, there it said that that meeting has approved and opinions on speeding up the establishment of national electricity market system. So since this has been approved, so I believe this high-level document may be released very soon, and this could be another significant or another key document following the document number 9 since 2015. So really looking forward to that. Well, so what is going on or what has happened since the October power tariff reform? It has been rolled out very quickly in provinces. So yeah, the top-down approach really worked quite quickly. Again, there's pressure from the power shortages as well. And already now, I think almost all the provinces, they have officially implemented the new rules, and they have widened the price fluctuation bands, etc. And they have also, especially when there is no upper limit for tariff for energy intensive industry. So more than 10 provinces has put this sort of a punishment tariff as well, more than 50% rise for this industry. And how do they implement that? Some of them did via the regular monthly power trading. This is an example. This is the stream from Sichuan Power Exchange when it did its November's thermal power trading for aluminum users. What's very interesting that you see it's a transaction and buyer and seller. There are 12 sellers and 4 buyers. And it's transacted for that November monthly contract is transacted at almost 700 yuan, so 90 euros. And this is not only 50, it's 75% from the coal power benchmark. So it is getting more costly for energy intensive industries in China. Well, that's mid to long-term trading. At the same time, what is really, I think what underpins liberalized power market is really the economic dispatch. So the spot trading where you have costs of generators determines the prices, so that price can fluctuate according according what the market needs. Well, China has been actually following the document number 9, following the 2015 power sector reform kickoff. China has been implementing 8 pilots since 2017, and this is a very good report overview from Rocky Mountain Institute, and it's publicly available. And so this chart is from there. You can see these provinces and how they are designed. Since 2017, but the goal is to, according to the regulator, is these 8 provinces has to conduct continuous spot trading by end of 2021. So now, but the status is lagging behind the goal. Only Shanxi is the only one with the continuous spot trading since this July. But the other provinces, Guangdong has one as spot test run from just 1 month or the other. And this month currently, Guangdong is having its November test run, and Zhejiang and Shannon will start soon. So we'll see if this goal really can be achieved. And there are 5 more pilots being announced that they should start very soon. And plus these regional spot markets, also especially in the southern provinces, as shown in Mac's map. So the post-spot pilot is moving ahead, and let's see the performance. So the chart on the left is the day ahead. Or electricity for delivery next day. So the spot prices in Guangdong's test run, the blue lines are now from November, and the orange line is from last August. And here the dotted line is the coal benchmark tariff. So why such a big jump? And we all know why, because coal prices has tripled this year compared to last year. And this really shows the essence on the spot price, because the coal power plants, they will bid in their fuel cost, which are based on more costly coal prices. So here is Qinhuangdao thermal coal and Zhengzhou coal futures, as well as European coal prices. We'll see the big jump really in September and October. So in Guangdong's new spot market test run, it actually in the first days, it cleared at 900 Chinese yuan, so very high. And also the Guangdong Power Exchange, they have introduced an interesting dynamic upper limit of coal and gas generators bidding prices, so that this bidding limit, it can go up if coal prices goes up. I think for a few sessions, actually, I've seen max prices coming up to 1,500 or 600 Chinese yuan. So yeah, I mean, that shows with a spot market, economic dispatch, how the generator can pass through the fuel cost to the prices. But again, to say that the spot market only covers less than 10% of Guangdong's provincial generation. So the rest are still either residential and agriculture, or they are transacted through mid to long term. But they're just getting a flavor of, let's imagine the whole of China moving to a spot-based market, and this determines power prices. Yes, I cannot only show you high prices because there are 8 pilots. And a really interesting example is the Shanxi province, which continued with its spot trading since July. And we all know Shanxi is a coal province, a coal producer, but it does has a lot of installed renewables. And in July, when coal prices went up, Shanxi spot market has cleared as high as 1,500 yuan. It was gas power plants on the margin. But again, that reflects the market prices, and it incentivized some load shedding, etc. So it was considered as, and quite, if the market has worked, it's effective. And then in early November was pretty interesting, the day ahead. So electricity for delivery next day, the prices plunged to just below 200 yuan on the day. And exactly why? Because it's both sunny and windy. And on those 2 days, the solar and wind, their max load, max production is more than half of Shanxi's provincial or Shanxi grid's load. So yeah, high renewables. We are here even in Shanxi province. But of course, I mean, this is for, we are not, if you follow power market, you know, it's, then you have duck curve as in California. And again, it's coming up a bit like the cannibalization of high share of renewables. We have high share of renewables. Their captured price will be lower. And this means less revenue. So how to solve that? It's a very heated debated topic in China now on renewables participation in power market, both in mid, long term and in sports. So I believe there are more rules will come. Actually, this is my concluding remarks. I think China's power sector reform already speeded up, but there are many policies, but we still need more. And the goal is ultimately to have new power system with renewables as the mainstay. So economic dispatch and flexible power pricing is definitely the final objective. And recent development is optimistic. But again, a nationwide or even a price zone type of spot market, I see is very unlikely before 2030. It will still be mid to long-term trading be dominating. And in the meantime, the dual track, where you have market and regulator, market and state operating at the same time, which could also create more, let's say, imbalances, more conflicts in between. So it's not easy for policymakers to solve that. So the slides will be made ready afterwards, available afterwards as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. That I think that, yeah, because it's we often talk about, greening the, clean energy, and we think of solar panels and wind turbines, but it's really the nuts and bolts is what's behind that with the grid and these markets. It's messy, it's complicated, but you guys are really helping to sort things out for us. And now to dive even deeper, Anders Hof, who's a project director for the Energy Transition Project at GIZ. He's in the Beijing office. But I think you've been in China about 10 years, right, Anders?
Yep, coming on 12 years, actually.
Dang. Well, he's going to, you're going to get us to understand a little bit better about what we mean by flexibility. There's a lot of electric vehicles coming onto the grid, the need for storage. How's it going to happen, Anders? I will mute myself and you can tell us your stories.
Yeah, I think I'm going to pick up after Jan's presentation, and I'm going to move back a little bit to the rigidities that Max was mentioning in the market, and then hopefully introduce a few ideas about how to resolve those rigidities. But a lot of these ideas, I think, are very familiar to anybody who's been working in power sector issues.
And let me just interject to remind the audience that underneath the stream here, there's a little widget to submit questions. I've gotten a handful of questions already, so start submitting now, because once Anders is done, I'm going to pepper them with questions, your questions. Thank you. Go ahead.
Just a brief word about my project. It's the Sino-German Energy Transition Project, is commissioned by the German government, the German Federal Ministry of Economic Affairs and Energy, in cooperation with the China National Energy Administration. And it's implemented by GIZ, as well as these organizations, both Chinese think tanks as well as German think tanks, basically doing research, sharing research about energy system transformation, not just power sector. The topics I'm just going to talk about, number one is going back, as I said, to talk about why China is rather inflexible compared to other markets. And then I'm going to talk at the end just very briefly about EV charging for grid flexibility, some of the research that we're doing there, as well as data centers for grid flexibility, which I think will be a rather more new topic for some of you. This is a chart of the German grid, and you can right now just go on Energy Chart's website, Fraunhofer website, and get any month or any day, any hour power production from any of the generation sources, or even individual coal plants. And that information is unfortunately not available for China or any Chinese province right now. But you can really look at this to see what we typically do kind of brag about in the German system, which would also be true in many other places, of course, which is showing how a high penetration of renewables paired with very flexible conventional power plants is what makes the German system work very well, very stable. And not just stable now, but even as the renewable output rises, it will continue to be stable through 2030, we believe. And what I outlined in these two red boxes overlaying the graph, one, the box on the left is showing a period with very high wind and solar. Solar is yellow, wind is this light greenish color. And then during the period of very high wind and solar, when demand is also fluctuating, you see that the thermal plants, which are in orange and brown and black, those are going up and down very rapidly, indicating that they can ramp up and down over the course of 15 minutes or so. And basically all of the coal fleet in Germany can do that. We've gotten questions about whether some plants are not capable or whether it's only for small plants that can ramp up and down. It's really the whole thermal fleet, and not so much the nuclear fleet yet, but, and of course that'll be shutting down anyway. Then on the right box, you can see the period when there's almost no renewables, but even there, the coal fleet is ramping up and down to reflect changes in demand. So there's really no such thing in Germany as baseload coal and gas anymore. And how is that possible? Well, basically, it's because the German power system has a very advanced energy market. It has a balancing market, self-scheduling by generators. And then in addition, I think a major reason why there's an economic incentive to be flexible is that the grid companies are forced to pay renewable generators if there's any curtailment. Now, compare that graph with this graph from a presentation by State Grid Energy Research Institute. And what you see there is that the red thermal coal plants are very flat in their output. And this is the vision of State Grid ERI for 2030. And when renewables come online, what's being portrayed there, and it's a little bit hard to see because it's too pixelated, but the solar output in the middle of the day is about half of that is going into storage, energy storage. So that's the vision of a lot of folks in China. And I think it would be typically a very comforting message to the thermal power producers and to conventional power producers, which is that they don't have to become more flexible. Most of the burden of dealing with both flexible load, fluctuating load and fluctuating renewable output is going to be through forcing the system to purchase more storage. In fact, as much storage capacity as there would exist renewables capacity in this vision, I think. And that's a very costly way of implementing flexibility, even if storage prices continue to fall. In our research report, which we did together with the Energy Research Institute of the National Development and Reform Commission, we looked at the quantifying the flexibility of Germany as compared with the region of Jingjiangji, which is near Beijing. And I think this is an important exercise because it shows that these types of policies can be measured quantitatively. A lot of times people in the industry will tell you, well, no, we're already as flexible as we can be, because they perceive that there's more cost than benefit, especially without a spot market, without really an active regional trading of electricity. The thermal plants would perceive that there's not too much benefit to becoming more flexible. The transmission grid operators also don't see a great financial benefit to becoming more flexible. So they would tend to prefer more stable operations and more operating hours, of course, to get more revenue. So we showed that basically quantitatively, the German power system is capable of much faster ramping up and down. And most of that flexibility is enabled through the thermal fleet being more flexible, which is what I just showed on those two charts. And the result of that is that the system is just much more reliable as a result. The loss of load probability, that's probability of basically a power outage, that is dramatically better in Germany than in this region of Jingjiangji, which is, just actually larger in population and definitely larger in energy consumption than Germany as a country is. And it's kind of concentrated in certain regions as well. And then some of the other measures as well don't show very good flexibility. This is what I mentioned earlier, that looking ahead to 2030, Germany also expects to continue to be very reliable. In fact, 20 times more reliable than the standard. And the reason for that is because of overcapacity outside of Germany due to capacity markets that are rewarding generators from staying open. Price signals, though, through the market, and also combined heat and power, and then transmission additions required by the EU. And I think basically that's pointing to what the solutions for flexibility probably are in China as well, which is not necessarily going directly to energy storage, which is much more costly, and then some of the more creative solutions that I'm going to talk about next. I just want to mention that there are a number of other academic articles that talk about the different solutions for flexibility in China under the high renewable penetration scenario mentioned by Max. Not necessarily that scenario specifically, but there are many such scenarios. This is a paper in Joule, which is free. I definitely recommend it, and it definitely puts forward that the transmission grid, as well as becoming more flexible for those thermal generators, and a little bit of investment on demand side flexibility as well. They mentioned charging electric vehicles, but the main solutions are those conventional solutions of adding more flexibility in the coal fleet and the transmission system. And basically what they find is that when you add in that flexibility, the cost of decarbonizing the power system goes from being a cost to being a negative cost. In other words, you're saving the system money. The IEA, International Energy Agency, also found the same thing in their 2019 report, which is basically that the major cost savings were achieved by integrating the various regional markets through the transmission system, enabling bidirectional power trading and spot power markets to enable that to happen in real time, near real time. And I'll just mention a very academic friend of ours, Michael Davidson's PhD thesis from 2017, which showed that essentially you could both essentially resolve curtailment in the northeast of China, which had been suffering curtailment of renewables up to kind of 20, even above 20%. You could reduce also the cost of the power system just by sharing the reserves between provinces. And that's just another way of saying opening up that market. The other thing that's important is that when we plan the power system, we know what our renewables are worth. And a lot of times in China, renewables, variable renewables, are given a value of 0 of reliability to provide energy when energy is needed. And I just thought I'd compare one value on the chart at the left, where wind is granted a 10% value, solar a 0% value, and just compare that with what California sees in 2026. Of course, California has much higher share of wind and solar than most of China does. And basically, you see that solar, the value of the effective load carrying capacity of solar is quite low, nearly 0%. With storage, it goes to 100% almost. And then wind is more in the 30% range. So basically, Jan already mentioned these policy measures, but I wanted to mention also that there are some other factors that are really pushing against those major policy reforms. Number one, there's a traffic light system. It's called the early warning alert system, which basically gives permission to the provinces about whether they can build new coal-fired power capacity to meet their load. And that system is really based more on a provincial self-sufficiency model, which is also highly preferred by the provinces themselves. Basically, the system does seem to regard provincial self-sufficiency, including self-sufficiency through thermal power, as the key to reliability. And reliability, or system security, is definitely a major priority for the government. Going to EVs, EV charging is obviously a potential solution. It doesn't necessarily require that you store energy in your vehicle. It could just be changing when the vehicles are charged. EV charging can be good or bad for the grid, depending on when it takes place. It can also be good or bad for carbon emissions, depending on when charging takes place. This is a study from a couple of years ago that basically showed the bad side. So you can get a view where charging increases emissions quite dramatically because charging ramps up too quickly for renewables or any other part of the system to be able to handle. So that's the bad case. And a study that we're working on is showing how if you change when EVs are charged and you look at different scenarios for when they are charged, you can dramatically change that. And basically here we show the optimized charging under different scenarios. One is an uncoordinated scenario. You see that EV charging takes place exactly when the peak load for the province already takes place. When you delay it, of course, that by definition delays it to after when the peak would be taking place. A valley filling, in other words, charging at the lowest load for that region, basically moves the charging to kind of in the middle of the night, and there's a big spike of charging as a result. Then when you look at the three other scenarios, renewables, flattening out the net load after considering renewables, and then just getting the cheapest power. When you look at those, there's a lot of similarity between those last three, and I think that's going to really show the value of the spot market once it comes into place in encouraging EV charging at the cleanest times, not just the cheapest times. Data centers as well, basically they are very rapidly growing load and actually growing much more quickly in terms of volume than the EV charging load, that's for sure. And China is home to something like, I think, 60,000 data centers, and it's something like 3 to 5% of the electric power consumption in the country. Now, data centers There are a lot of data center tasks that are not high priority. What we're doing right now, this would be a very immediate data center need that could not be shifted to another time, but it could be shifted to a different location in the country if there were cheaper energy available for processing the information. And for other loads, like if you think about some really complicated model that you're running, that you go to bed, you think it's going to take a couple of hours, but that could be 2 hours from now. It doesn't have to be right now. You can delay loads as well. So data center offers some flexibility potential, but mostly that exists more in theory. Now, there are some data centers doing geographical load shifting in China, and those are the really big players that have multiple data centers and are famous internet giants that we would have all heard of. But basically what we hear from data centers is, and I think this is just very representative of what goes on across China's industrial sectors, all the high energy intensive industries, which is they basically take a very passive view towards power prices. They view power prices as something that ought to be sort of fixed, and electric power as being something that should always be on and reliable. And basically they consider their revenue as their main task to monitor, maximize your revenue, and cost management, especially energy cost management, not so important. If it is important, they would look mostly at efficiency, not saving money by changing when they are consuming power, even if the market does evolve to give a much bigger time of use price signal, as Jan discussed. And basically what we found is that most of the data centers think that even with a major market signal, they probably would not want to get into the business of flexibility. So in order to become flexible, or in order to absorb more renewable energy, they probably need something more administrative. And one example of such a policy, which I think is going to be very important for all of the energy intensive industries. By the way, data centers are one of the dual high industries. So that's highly energy intensive and energy and emissions intensive. They're not in the main 7, they're in the still allowed to grow additional +1 dual high sectors. Basically, all these dual high sectors are going to be closely monitoring the rules on orderly power consumption. So there's, in other words, who gets shut off first if there's a major power crisis. So that could be a major way to incentivize data centers, which obviously need to be reliable, to be more flexible. So I'm going to stop there, basically just give you my overall conclusion, which is that China is not as flexible as it could be. There are policy solutions on the way, but major challenges as well. And then these other 2 solutions are still some ways away from being implemented. And they're not necessarily the first solutions to flexibility that I would prioritize. That's it for me. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Anders. You know, and thank all 3 of you for speaking. I'm actually a yoga teacher on the side, and I kept thinking, flexibility is good. And you guys are showing me that even in the power sector, flexibility is indeed good, but challenging. Yeah, I've getting a bunch of questions in, so I'm going to ask I'll ask a couple in pairs, and then hopefully you guys can be succinct because we only got a little under 25 minutes to go. All right, you guys ready? Let's gear it up here. I got 2 questions that came in about the emission trading system. EUN, a research analyst, I believe she's at IMF. China has started to scale up its ETS on the national level in July. From your perspective, what would be the biggest short-term challenge? Do you think the intensity-based cap scheme would be efficient to reduce the carbon emissions? And Hazel Lee at World Bank, a former intern of mine, she's very inspired by your talks to see how the higher share of renewables are getting onto the grid. But her question, and this one would be for Yen, what implications and influence will the power market deregulation have for China's newly launched national carbon trading schemes? Thanks. So Yen, do you want to start off? Give us insights, is there a connection?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, no, I'm a carbon market analyst, power and carbon market analyst. So this is right to what I follow on a daily basis, hourly basis too. Yes, China launches national carbon market this year after really a decade in the making and starting from pilots. But from this year, all of China's thermal power plants, so it's coal and gas power plants, in an annual emission of 4.5 gigaton. So that's all of EU's yearly emissions. They are covered on the national emissions trading scheme. Well, price so the market started trading on 16th of July. Price has been around as high as 60 yuan, but now as of this morning is 43 yuan. So 5-6 euros, as you say, it's a fraction of what's in the European carbon market. Yes, and exactly as the question says, China's ETS currently has intensity-based target. There is no absolute amount of allowances, which is what we have in the European carbon market. So in China currently, even if a coal power plant, but if you're efficient and if you generate more, you actually get more allowances. But of course, the intensity-based target, which is basically set at your emission intensity of your per megawatt hour of emissions. And this is meant to incentivize, of course, more efficient coal power plants and to help to retire the old ones. So more gradual improvement of the fleet. So with China currently has 1,100 gigawatt of coal capacity. Of course, around 20-30 of them are very inefficient. So the ETS can contribute to that. But on the other hand, it has shortcoming is that it provides its incentives, or it provides as a subsidy or incentives for the efficient coal plants. So this is, in the near term, so this is really a shortcoming. But of course, this really limit in how much the ETS price can go and how much ETS can be effective. On the other hand, the ETS target should be linked to China's overall climate target, and China has a goal of peak emissions before 2030, and China has not announced an overall absolute emissions target yet for nationally. So my expectation is that when China announces, let's say, okay, our emissions cannot go above, let's say, 11 gigaton or as such in 2028. And I believe that is when it will affect the ETS target as well. But in the next few years, we might still have the intensity-based cap. But of course, it's exciting times. Only 2 weeks left until the compliance deadline in China's ETS. And we can see the market trading has picked up lately. So quite exciting times. We'll see by year end.
Yeah, it's like there's no just hanging out and sipping tea in your office. You've got a lot to follow there, Yan. I've got a couple of questions here. One from Tyler Harlan from Loyola Marymount University, also a China fellow at the Wilson Center. He said, thanks for these great presentations. What are the remaining barriers to effective cross-provincial power trading? Is this purely a question of implementing a national market, or are there other diverging interests and institutional barriers at work? And then I also have kind of related to that my own question, because like today, I mean, you guys, it sounds like there's several different kinds of electricity markets that are being set up at the same time. And can they really work together, or is there going to be kind of confusion or problems for clean energy? And then I was, thinking, and then as kind of a side note to that, I was like, do we have the same kind of problem here in the States or Europe? Okay, who wants to grab that one? Max, Anders?
I could say a couple words.
Yeah,
I think we could all jump in on this one probably, but I think that what we were discussing right before is the volumes matter, and probably the interprovincial markets will continue to be very thin and dominated by the mid to long-term power trading that Yan mentioned was a contributing factor to some of the power crises earlier this year. And basically, I think that the government has been very cautious and did not want the smart market to grow too quickly. And that might raise the possibility of even more fluctuations in power prices. So of course, Yan mentioned the possibility that power prices can float upward by up to 20% for most industries. And then for those dual high, they can go much higher. But I think the government is still very wary of price increases. Yes, they can go up, but I think that they're going to be tightly controlled, and spot markets getting too large in terms of volume, both within province and between provinces, that really does risk the financial health of coal producers and does raise a large potential for the price controls that the government has in place to become difficult to manage. So I would expect that they would continue to be very small in volume, very thin, and yes, they would be working, but they wouldn't be having a very big impact on the overall incentives in the power sector as a whole.
Max, do you have anything you wanted to add to that, or you want to?
Sure, I'll add. As far as these regional markets are concerned, as I mentioned, the southern grid region, the 5-province region and around Guangdong, has been slated for a few years to be the first, officially the first regional spot market based on the development first of Guangdong's spot market, which Yan mentioned is now getting underway. So, but a problem with that is that the southern grid framework has been fairly slow to emerge publicly, and there are unanswered questions, still basic unanswered questions about how the southern grid markets is going to look, what the institutions that govern the spot market are going to be, how the provincial markets in these 5 provinces are going to be knitted together, or whether there'll be just a single footprint with a single market for the entire region with with a single governance system. So that's something we're continuing to watch closely, and there are a discussion of other regional markets in other parts of the country, but I think southern grid's still a place where traditionally ideas are brewed, and it will be a place to watch. I'll just mention one other thing on the markets is that competition is obviously a part of markets, but in a lot of provinces, these markets or a lot of provinces are still dominated by a couple of major state-owned enterprises. So the idea of actually having effective competition may be elusive, particularly in the Northwest region, where there's an effort underway to consolidate the ownership of generation by the agency that oversees state-owned enterprises. So it's really, I think, a challenge will be coming up with workable market-like mechanisms that do the kind of things that we want from markets, motivating that efficient dispatch and motivating that flexibility in the face of what might, for the near term, be difficulty having real competition on the ground in some places. I'll leave it at that. There's a lot more to say on that subject, but I'll pause here because I know we have other questions, Jennifer.
Let me toss you a few more questions from our audience here. You guys keep putting in questions in here. Friend of everyone here, Dave Moskovich. He said, Anders said one important reason Germany fossil units are now flexible is that grid companies have to pay renewables if the renewables are curtailed. I think that's worth emphasizing. How does this powerful incentive on grid companies translate to motivate fossil generators? And can China do this? I was pretty impressed with that. So if you have to curtail your solar, then the fossil companies coal companies have to pay them. Is that right?
The transmission system operators or the distribution system operators have to pay that. So it really incentivizes those TSOs to do a good job managing their dispatch. Although I mean self-dispatch in Germany, so self-scheduling. I mean, but basically the grid operator has strong incentive to work together with generators to make sure that this system works well. And China did basically draft rules that required some compensation for renewables curtailment. But the system with renewables in China in terms of what hours they are guaranteed has been shifting a lot over the years. And basically China has set this kind of 3-tiered system where wind plants, if they operate more than a certain amount per month or per year, then they're beyond what's guaranteed. They're guaranteed to be paid for under the feed-in tariff system. And then that guarantee is set at a level that's quite low in some regions, and then they're supposed to submit their excess energy to the market, whatever market might exist, but then that market might be very dominated by the grid company or by a single province that they could sell into that's neighboring where they are. So the way that this compensation scheme in China has been implemented, it's not so clear whether that's a meaningful incentive right now. But you can see that clearly the grid companies have changed their behavior, I think, and really reduced curtailment. I think that is because of some extra performance incentives that were not necessarily purely market-based around reducing incentives. In particular, the government set this 5% planning target that said that by 2020, all the grid companies and all the provinces would have to get below 5% curtailment. I think that performance incentive did the trick, but it was more of an administrative requirement than a market incentive.
Yeah, I did like your line when you said market-like, and I also was thinking like market light as well, that in China that there is this, that the state is still kind of in there to cajole and
there is no such thing as a perfect electricity market. There is no such thing as a totally free market in electricity. And I think Dave Moskowitz is very well aware of that.
Yes. Okay, Max, looks like you had something to say there. You were bursting.
Well, I think Anders hit the right point at the end. There was enormous pressure put on the grid companies from the middle of last decade. Soon after the time when the President Obama and President Xi signed a joint agreement that emphasized the issue of reducing curtailment. And soon after that, the premier came out with targets for the grid companies, Anders mentioned, and the grid companies really did feel a very strong incentive after that, and we saw results. But as we talked about, there's a big challenge to come keeping this integration of renewable energy going, and the grid companies are going to have to continue to find new solutions and others.
Great. Thank you guys for giving great answers, fast, smart. The first question I got at 9:01, I should get Terry Hill asked, this is kind of more, I guess we're getting a little bit into tech here. Whoops, wait, skip down off of it. Asked the question, besides high voltage direct current in the transmission grids, do you see a role for low voltage direct current in nano and microgrids in China? And then another question that just, another kind of technical one, similar, please comment on the perspective of new technologies for long distance high power. So DC versus AC, superconductant, zero loss transmission. And is this going to be, am I going to go
I recently asked this question about the DC microgrids to one of our research partners in Germany, the University of Wuppertal, actually. And essentially the cost numbers don't pan out for that. Basically you're talking about an extra grid, but the benefits to that are not commensurate in terms of savings. I mean, I think it's in principle interesting how in advanced economies, post-industrial societies where residential consumers are a bigger share than in China, it seems like, oh, well, we run our TVs, our lights, and our computers, and our devices are all DC powered, and maybe we have solar, so why don't we just have DC? But unfortunately, you can't just take uncontrolled, uncleaned up output of a solar panel and plug it in directly. You have to go into AC before then converting it back to DC to plug in your car. So does it really make sense if you have to do that round trip conversion to run any of your devices from DC to have a DC microgrid layered in there? And I think the cost of adding that extra grid doesn't make sense. It would be a microgrid would be more AC, is my understanding.
Okay, I'm thinking AC/DC here. Okay, so what about another kind of distributed power? So rooftop, bringing the renewables closer to the cities. We know that China's just done some massive installations of offshore wind. I think I love it in China. Their numbers in 1 year they put as much offshore wind as exists in the rest of the world. Could you guys tell me something about what are you seeing about the perspective and and I again novice here, but I was wondering, is this also good for the provincial trading as more provinces are getting their own distributed power? Is that something that gets into the spot trading as well?
Yeah, there's something I want to just jump in and clarify here as well, which is that distributed energy is often discussed with different terminology in China. And basically the numbers, when you hear distributed solar mentioned in China, a lot of times it's very large ground mounted installations. It could be 10 megawatts, something we would not consider distributed energy in California or Germany. But basically rooftop solar has recently been taking off, and I try to get a handle on where these rooftop solar plants are. But definitely, it grew by a factor of more than 4 last year. And I think that was because of some very directed subsidies towards village electrification, as well as some very planned developments that were taken over by the grid companies. So I think that's one of the paradoxes, is that there's this vision that Max put on screen in his first slide of this more interesting and diverse energy system and more diverse energy paradigm with more decentralized players. But in China, the energy system is much more state-owned than it is in other countries. And we certainly have utilities that behave like state-owned entities in many countries, but it's not quite as state-dominated as China, where the SOEs really are the planners of the policies themselves to a much greater extent than in most other countries. And so that's why I think you've seen that the incumbent energy companies had essentially been blocking a lot of the distributed deployments. And in addition, when it comes time when the government says, actually it makes sense, we need to do more distributed energy, what you see then is that those SOE players jump in and do it at scale, but in a very, let's say, not in a decentralized way, but in a very planned fashion, where it's going out to certain places that they view as ideal and just doing it everywhere in a certain geography, as opposed to the market kind of saying, hey, and of course people live in high rises, but where distributed energy would make a lot of sense in China is in industry parks. China has dominant share of industry and energy consumption. And then most industry parks have this very large area of flat roofs that are just totally empty, basically blue sheets of metal that you see when you're flying over cities. And in talks with industry parks, what we find is that they just have a total passive attitude towards getting clean energy, that they view it as unattractive. They think that paying any premium for green electricity would not make sense for them, and installing it on their building doesn't make sense unless the payback period is like 2 years, because, hey, well, I only have a 2-year lease on this building anyway. And the energy park is like, well, we just pass the electricity cost on to our consumers, so we don't care about that. They're not asking, all they want is reliable power.
Exactly.
So here again, the administrative measures are probably essential. It has to be something where the government says, we're going to actually say that for orderly power consumption rules, industry parks that have implemented something here, they get priority. Or they get something that's not just a market benefit, not just an IRR of 30%, don't care.
Okay.
Don't care about that.
Well, let me just to wrap us up here, because I want Max, and then I'm going to go to you, Yan. I'm going to ask you guys 2 questions like that, because, Max, you do a lot of work focused on the US. We've talked mainly about China grid reforms. Is there an opportunity for the US and China to, RAP, you guys are working with China. What can you give us some sense about, in terms of power reforms and grid, what the US and China could it be can we get back to dancing together on this topic?
Well, in about 10 seconds, I'll just say that it is encouraging to see the joint statement that came out at the COP summit, where the US and China somewhat surprisingly came out with a joint agreement. And they did single out a lot of the issues that we're interested in, that we're working on day to day. And I don't think that there's always a direct comparison about what the reforms that are going on in the 2 countries, but there's certainly a lot of interest, certainly a lot of chance to illuminate the discussion and keep that moving along jointly.
And importantly, and that kind of cooperation, could it be a 2-way? Is there
absolutely? I think there's a lot going on in that could be in both directions. In China, there's a lot of interest in what's going on in the US. I often wish there was more interest in the US about what's going on in China, but we'll see what we can do about that. We're making progress today, I think.
Yeah, I think that we're going to be doing another meeting on grids, and we'll dive a little bit deeper on what's happening in the US. But just Yen, same question. Do you see, is there ongoing work between EU or and China on grid issues, the trading, et cetera?
Yeah, no, it's definitely a lot. I mean, you have the ECCP, the EU-China Energy Collaboration Platform, that I think it's next in 1 week. Actually, it'll be a flagship event on the NSOE report. NSOE is so definitely that's spot on the grid. And also exactly why I have that map on my first slide is because I'm often asked, okay, so in Europe, I mean, Norway is like the green battery for Europe, and how can you do that? That's why I start to make the map and discuss with China's experts in China on their interest in the grid and how they collaborate, and interconnectors, how they work, and how you improve power market design. Then we have cross country, and we have also cross provincial power trading and improving the power transmission. So yeah, there has been a lot of collaboration and also be more.
No, but this is great. I really, I mean, I feel like you guys have increased the knowledge of the audience on like the whole grid question. And we're going to be diving more deeply into grid questions soon. So I'll probably pull some of you back, maybe with a different combo of people. Can't thank you enough. Also want to remind our listeners that tomorrow morning, hopefully with a functioning Mac, I'm glaring at my Mac right here, right now. We have a meeting on plastic and climate issues. It's focused more globally, but we do have one speaker talking about China. So again, energy sector, this is the power reforms is meant to, help decrease CO2 emissions, but the kind of a hidden cost of a hidden source of CO2 is also from the plastic industry. So tune in tomorrow. Thank all of you, and we will see you soon, maybe even in person. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Have a good morning or evening.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Bye.